So this section is section 12, correlation out of Making Sense of Statistics. So correlation refers to the extent to which two variables are related across a group of participants. So let's talk about, well, we can see if we look at two students who score high on their SATV also had the highest GPA. So you can see Janet had an SATV score of 756. Scotty has an SAT score of 629. Each of them have over a 3-point. Their SATV and their GPA are both high. This is called a direct relationship. It's also called a positive relationship. In a direct or positive relationship, those who score high on one variable tend to score high on another. Now let's also look at, here again, this is a direct or positive relationship where those who score low on one variable tend to score low on another variable. So one of the ways that we can think of how a direct relationship or a positive relationship works, I like to think of this in terms of arrows. So if we have a high score on variable 1, we also have a high score on variable 2. And also if we have a low score on variable 1, we have a low score on. So let's look at example 2. Which also shows scores on two variables for one group of participants. The first variable is self-concept, which is measured with 12 true-false items containing statements such as, I feel good about myself when I'm in public. Participants earn 1 point for each statement they mark as being true. So a self-concept score could range from 0, so the lowest score could be a 0, marking all statements as false, to a 12, marking all statements as true. So obviously the higher the participant score, the higher the self-concept. So that's on self-concept. On depression, the second variable is depression, which is measured with a standardized depression scale. And the scores range from a 20 to an 80. Higher scores indicate higher depression. So what we want to ask ourselves, do the data indicate there is a relationship between self-concept and depression? Let's look at these two participants, Sally and Jose. If you notice, they have a high self-concept score of 12, being the highest possible score. And they also have a relatively low score on their depression, on the depression scale. So there is possibly a relationship. Well, what is the relationship? Let's also look at, we have participants with low self-concept scores that have relatively high depression scores. So in other words, those with higher self-concept tend to have lower depression scores, while those with a lower self-concept tend to have higher depression scores. This relationship, so there is in fact a relationship, the data do indicate there is a relationship between self-concept and depression. This relationship is called an inverse or a negative relationship. So in an inverse or negative relationship, we have those who score high on one variable tend to score low on the other. Relationship also, if we have a score on variable 1 as high and a score on variable 2 as low, that also is an inverse or a negative relationship. Now, one thing that the data does not establish, which in example 2, is it does not establish whether having a low self-concept causes depression or being depressed causes an individual to have a low self-concept. In fact, there might not be any relationship at all between the two variables because there could be a host of other variables like life circumstances, genetic disposition, etc. might account for the relationship between self-concept and depression. So, for instance, having a disruptive home life might cause some individuals to have a low self-concept and at the same time could cause some of these individuals to be depressed. Now, let's also note then, this is important to remember that correlation, okay, and again, let's make this very clear. The data do not establish whether having a low self-concept causes depression or being depressed causes an individual to have a low self-concept. Talk about a cause and effect. We have a control experiment which is needed in which different treatments would be administered to the participants. And we talked about this earlier in the semester. So we could examine a possible causal link. So we could have the researcher could give the experimental group a treatment to improve self-concept and then compare the average level of depression of the experimental group with the also what we could do is we can also use correlations to develop a theory. So correlations are of interest in developing a theory. So we can we have a postulate of a theory that may indicate that X should be related to Y. If a correlation is found in a correlational study, then the finding helps support the theory. If it's not, it calls the theory into. So also, let's look at example 3. Only up to this point we've had clear-cut examples. So in practice, correlational data almost always includes individuals who are exceptions to the overall trend, making the degree of correlation less obvious. So now we're using the same data that we had as example 1, but we've added Joe and Patricia. So now let's look at Joe and Patricia. If you note that Joe has a higher SATV, but he has a low GPA. Patricia has a lower SATV but a higher GPA. Now, you know, you're in college, and so you could understand how someone who had a higher SATV did not do well in college. Joe could have had a family crisis during his first year in college. He may have abandoned his good work habits. He might have gone to a lot of campus parties as soon as he moved away from home to college. It could also be that Joe might just be really, really good at taking standardized tests, but never really learned how to study. So we could also look at it from that standpoint. Now with Patricia, maybe Patricia made an extra effort to apply herself in college. And this could not be predicted by her SATV. One of the things is that because we have writing centers and because we have the ability to have access with help with our math and statistics, you know, you could apply yourself more and have a much higher GPA than what your SATV might indicate. Are exceptions to the rule. Joe's college GPA, while low, he has a high SATV score, and these are what type of relationships? These are inverse relationships. And then, of course, we can look GPA, which is high, and her SATV score, which is low. Remember that when we are studying hundreds of participants, and probably with the SATV, you might want to say thousands of participants, there are many, many exceptions. Some are really large, some are small. And to make sense of this data, other statistical techniques will be required, and we'll be looking at this in the next few sections. This concludes Section 12, Correlation in Making Sense of Statistics.